Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so for millennia, humanity has wrestled with basically the ultimate philosophical dilemma. I mean, if a supreme god is perfectly good and all-powerful, why does profound evil exist?
Right, it's the big question.
Exactly. So today we are unpacking how ancient minds essentially invented the concepts of the devil, hell, and linear time to answer that exact question.
And we're going to explore how those ancient frameworks shape modern belief,
Yeah.
like how they actively fuel modern arguments for atheism today.
Sure.
Plus, how the physical manifestations of evil, from terrifying historical exorcisms to, well, local monsters, reflect our deepest anxieties about divine order.
We've got a massive stack of historical and theological sources for this deep dive. We're looking at documentaries and lectures on the origins of the devil, Zoroastrianism, and unexplained geographical phenomena.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but our mission is just to impartially unpack the evolution of God, the devil, and the origins of evil. We aren't taking any religious or political sides here. We are strictly looking at what history tells us.
Exactly.
And hey, real quick, before we jump in, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button.
It is so crucial to examine these historical shifts objectively. Because whether you are deeply religious or a strict atheist or, somewhere completely in between,
Right.
understanding these concepts is really the key to understanding the foundation of Western morality. You are operating within these ancient frameworks every single day,
Yeah.
whether you actually realize it or not.
So true. Well, let's start with the philosophical elephant in the room. When you look at modern atheistic critiques of religion, the core argument almost always centers around what philosophers call the problem of evil.
Yes, the classic trilemma.
Right. It goes like this. If God is all-knowing, he sees all the suffering in the world. If he's all-powerful, he has the ability to stop it. And if he is perfectly good, he should want to stop it.
But obviously, suffering is everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, childhood diseases exist. Devastating, senseless wars exist. And for a lot of people, that feels like a massive logical contradiction that completely shatters the idea of a benevolent deity.
It really is the ultimate theological bottleneck. And
Yeah.
you're right, it's the primary driver for a huge portion of secular or atheistic thought today. But what is truly fascinating is that one of the oldest continuously practiced religions in human history actually structurally solved this problem over 3,000 years ago.
Wait, really? Which one?
We're talking about Zoroastrianism. It emerged from the Iranian plateau somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE.
Wow, so way back.
Oh, yeah. To set the stage, before their prophet Zoroaster came along, the religious landscape there was largely polytheistic. You had a god for the rain, a god for the harvest, a god for war.
The usual setup for the ancient world.
Right. But Zoroaster introduced this radical shift. A supreme creator deity named Ahura Mazda, which translates to the wise lord. And crucially, Ahura Mazda doesn't just build things with his hands like some celestial mechanic.
Okay, so how does he do it?
He creates through thought,
Right.
through pure conscious intention.
Okay, so if Ahura Mazda is creating order and goodness purely through divine intention, where does the chaos come from? I mean, is this a fallen angel situation, like we see in later religious traditions where God creates a beautiful being that just eventually rebels?
See, that is the assumption most people make, mostly because of how prevalent that fallen angel narrative is today. But in Zoroastrianism, the setup is entirely different.
How so?
Ahura Mazda is opposed by a being called Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. And Angra Mainyu is absolutely not a creation of Ahura Mazda.
He's not.
No, he is an entirely uncreated, independent entity who actively chose to oppose cosmic order. He just exists, completely parallel to the creator.
Oh, wow. Well, that drastically shifts the entire dynamic of the trilemma we just talked about.
It really does.
Because if God didn't create the entity causing the evil, and he isn't secretly permitting it as some kind of test of faith, then the Zoroastrian solution is essentially that God is supremely good, but he isn't omnipotent.
Exactly.
He simply does not have unlimited absolute power over everything in the universe at this current moment.
You hit the nail on the head. It completely bypasses that modern atheistic critique. Evil exists because a genuine, independent cosmic adversary is actively producing it.
Right.
Ahura Mazda is fighting that evil with all his resources.
Yeah.
But it's a real grueling war with actual terrifying stakes.
It's almost like God is a brilliant grandmaster playing chess against a real independent opponent rather than a programmer who wrote both sides of the simulation and is just, pretending to struggle.
Oh, that is a perfect analogy.
Because when you play both sides of the board, the tension is fake, the outcome is predetermined, but in this framework, the stakes are completely real.
Right, and because those stakes in the cosmic chess match are real, it introduces the concept of radical free will for humanity. In this worldview, you aren't just a passive pawn on the board. You're an active moral agent.
So human choices actually matter to the gods.
Absolutely. The universe is fractured down the middle between Asha, which represents truth and cosmic order, and Druj, which is the lie, chaos, and deception.
Okay.
Every thought you have, every single word you speak, genuinely tips the scales in this cosmic battle.
Man, that philosophy gives ordinary life a massive amount of gravity. But, an abstract cosmic chess match is incredibly tough to visualize, especially if you're an average person living 3,000 years ago.
Oh, for sure.
You need something you can see. You'd need to ground this massive abstract battle between good and evil into physical reality, which I guess brings us to geography.
Yeah, humans have this deep psychological need to localize evil and holiness in physical spaces. Abstract concepts are notoriously difficult to maintain over generations without a physical anchor.
That makes total sense.
And historically speaking, framing these concepts physically was a highly effective way for enforcing religious compliance.
Which introduces a pretty dark historical reality in our sources. There's a physical valley just outside the walls of ancient Jerusalem called the Valley of Hinnom.
Right, a very grim place.
Yeah, historically, this wasn't just a spooky metaphor. It was a site of actual child sacrifice. Imagine you're a farmer in the ancient world. You don't understand meteorology or germ theory.
You're just at the mercy of the elements.
Exactly. Your crops are failing, disease is spreading, and you genuinely believe that if you don't appease the dark forces, your entire community will starve. People were so terrified of this chaos that they would create actual pits of fire in this valley and sacrifice their firstborn children to satanic demons.
The psychological scar that valley left on the human consciousness is just staggering. The Hebrew name for the Valley of Hinnom is Gehenna.
Gehenna.
Right. And that word literally became the linguistic root and the conceptual blueprint for the modern concept of hell. The physical trauma of that specific geographic location was so profound and so horrific that it became the universal stand-in for eternal damnation.
And there's a really clear mechanism of social control at play here, too. Once you establish a concept of an eternal physical hell based on that visceral fear, it naturally becomes a tool.
Oh, absolutely.
Follow the rules of the religious clerics or you will end up in the fire forever. It is exactly the dynamic that modern atheistic critiques point out when they argue that religion was engineered as a means of population control.
It is an undeniable historical mechanism. The fear of a physical hell has undoubtedly been weaponized throughout history. But humans don't just localize evil and punishment.
What else do we localize?
We also localize mystery, awe, and the limits of our own understanding. Contrast that dark, fiery valley in Jerusalem with something completely different. Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Oh yeah, that is a perfect contrast. For those who don't know, Devil's Tower is a 900-foot colossal shaft of volcanic rock that just shoots straight up out of the flat sedimentary plains in the American West.
It's incredible to see.
It really is. And the massive scientific conundrum is that there is absolutely zero other volcanic activity anywhere around it. It's like a skyscraper made of magma, which just dropped from the sky onto a flat prairie.
Right, and because it is such a jarring geological anomaly, different cultures have constantly projected their own frameworks onto it to try and make sense of it.
Like who?
Well, for many Native American tribes, it is a profoundly sacred place. It's viewed as a literal earthly altar where one can receive divine inspiration. It represents a connection to the higher order, to Asha.
Okay, so it's holy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then look at how modern pop culture processes that exact same mystery. Steven Spielberg heavily featured Devil's Tower in his 1970s film Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Oh, right, the mashed potato mountain.
Yeah, and almost overnight, it was reframed in the modern mythos as a landing site for UFOs.
Wait, so a 900-foot volcanic anomaly just exists on a flat plain, defying all geological norms, and depending on the century, we either call it an altar, the Devil's Tower, or an alien landing pad.
Pretty much.
It seems like whenever we hit the absolute limits of our scientific understanding, we immediately fill that intellectual gap with either gods, demons, or aliens. It's almost as if Devil's Tower forces mankind to remain humble.
That's a great way to put it.
Geography itself is confronting us with the fact that we do not have all the answers, and our brains just desperately want to fill in the blanks.
It is a massive monument to the unknown. But, you know, a 900-foot rock in Wyoming is still a distant static mystery.
Sure.
It's easy to walk away from a mountain. It's a lot harder to walk away when that mystery, that chaos, follows you home and hides in your local woods.
Oh, yeah.
The fear of the adversary eventually bleeds out of distant valleys and invades our personal spaces.
Which brings us to the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey and the concept of literal monsters.
Yes.
The Pine Barrens is a 1,000,000-acre expanse of dense, dark, incredibly isolated woods. Even the Native American tribes originally called it the place of the dragon, so the geography was already deeply associated with monstrous forces long before European colonists ever arrived.
That historical continuity is vital. The landscape itself is completely primed for human projection.
So the specific legend of the Jersey Devil starts in 1735. A woman named Mother Leeds is giving birth to her 13th child. And according to local lore, she is so exhausted and frustrated that she cries out, "Let the devil take this one."
Careful what you wish for.
Right. And supposedly she gives birth to a creature with a horse's head, bat wings, and hooves that immediately flies up the chimney. Now, if the story stopped there, you could easily brush it off as typical colonial folklore used to scare children.
Sure, just a spooky bedtime story.
But the historical record details an unprecedented mass panic that erupted way later, in 1909.
The 1909 panic is a phenomenal case study in mass psychology. For an entire week, you had hundreds of independent sightings of this creature.
Hundreds.
Hundreds. This wasn't just a few spooky stories around a campfire. Schools were entirely shut down. Businesses closed their doors. People were literally barricading themselves indoors with loaded weapons.
That is wild.
A trolley car in Hayden Heights was allegedly dive-bombed by the creature in broad daylight. The panic was so severe and widely accepted that the Philadelphia Zoo officially offered a $10,000 reward for its capture.
And it wasn't just easily frightened locals getting swept up in a hysteria either. Years prior to this, Naval Commodore Stephen Decatur, who was a highly distinguished, pragmatic war hero, claimed he saw the creature flying overhead while he was testing artillery.
A military man.
Yeah, he actually fired a cannonball right through its wing. And according to his account, it just kept flying.
See, this raises an essential point about how we manifest our fears. When a community collectively projects its deep-seated anxieties about the wilderness, about the uncontrollable forces of nature, into a physical avatar like the Jersey Devil, the resulting panic is as real and damaging as any physical threat.
The fear itself becomes the monster.
Exactly. The boundary between a psychological terror and a physical reality blurs. But that boundary vanishes entirely when the chaos doesn't just haunt the local woods, but actively takes over a human being.
Exorcisms. We see this blurring of lines so clearly in the historical accounts of possession. Take the viral moment from May 2013.
Oh, the Pope Francis video.
Yeah, Pope Francis was in St. Peter's Square, and he laid his hands on a man in a wheelchair who was allegedly possessed. The footage shows him reciting a prayer, and the man physically reacting in a deeply unsettling, visceral way.
The practice of exorcism is as old as recorded history. We find extensive accounts in ancient texts from India, China, and the Near East.
It's everywhere.
It really is. What modern Catholic exorcists highlight, however, is the intensely physical nature of these claims. They report witnessing phenomena that completely violate the normal laws of physics and biology.
Like what kind of phenomena?
Well, they document cases of a 110-pound woman easily throwing 3 grown men across a room, radical and impossible changes in eye color or facial structure, and even claims of full-on levitation.
Our sources also detail the use of holy objects in these rituals, things like rosaries, holy water, and crucifixes. But the priests aren't treating these objects like magical talismans. They're using them as symbolic expressions of authority to drive out the chaos, basically to banish the drudge we talked about earlier.
Right.
But I want to pause on something that stood out sharply in the historical material. The exorcists themselves openly state that the people they treat are frequently highly psychologically balanced professionals.
Yeah, they aren't all just struggling with known mental illnesses.
Right. And the priests claim that they are actually healing the person on 2 tracks simultaneously, the spiritual and the psychological. They explicitly note that the demonic presence feeds off of deeply rooted internal wounds, things like chronic anger, severe trauma, and unforgiveness.
That is the most crucial overlap in this entire discussion. The exorcists fully acknowledge that if you can heal the inner psychological wounds, the demonic presence essentially starves. It just has less raw material to feed on.
So I have to push back on the supernatural element here just a bit. The accounts mention that levitation and super strength violate the laws of normal science. But at the exact same time, the exorcists admit they are actively healing psychological wounds. If you are a secular listener analyzing this, couldn't the demons simply be a profound, dramatic metaphor for untreated human trauma manifesting physically?
That's a very fair question.
I mean, we know that the body keeps the score. Extreme stress can cause horrific physical ailments. Couldn't this just be what it looks like when profound psychological trauma takes on a physical avatar inside the human nervous system?
That is a highly valid, robust secular interpretation. And honestly, whether you view it as a literal spiritual entity invading a human host or as a severe dissociative psychological manifestation of deep-seated trauma, the outcome on the ground is identical.
The suffering is real either way.
Exactly. The individual is trapped in a profound state of chaos, suffering, and isolation. The ritual of exorcism, in that light, provides a highly structured, authoritative, and culturally resonant framework for confronting and banishing that internal chaos. It reestablishes a sense of cosmic order for the sufferer.
It's the ancient battle of Asha and Druj playing out not in the cosmos, but inside the human nervous system.
Powerfully said.
Which naturally forces us to look at the horizon. If humanity has been fighting this exhausting, terrifying battle against trauma, evil, chaos, and the adversary for thousands of years, how does the story actually end?
To answer that, we have to return to Zoroaster, because he gave humanity one of its most revolutionary and foundational concepts, linear time.
Linear time.
Yeah, before Zoroaster, the prevailing philosophical or religious belief worldwide was that time was cyclical. The universe just repeated the same endless loops of creation, decay, and destruction, much like the changing of the seasons. There was no grand finale, no ultimate resolution.
Just a cosmic hamster wheel of existence. You live, you suffer, you die, and the universe just reboots and does it all over again forever.
Precisely. But Zoroaster proposed a radical alternative. He argued that time is a line. It has a definitive beginning, a long middle period of mixture where good and evil fight their agonizing war, and it has a definitive final end.
Okay, so a finish line.
Yes. He called this endpoint the reshaped, which translates to making wonderful, or the final, ultimate renovation of the universe.
And the specifics of this endgame are incredibly striking. The framework involves the resurrection of the dead in their physical bodies and the arrival of a cosmic savior figure called the Saoshyant, who is born of a virgin.
Right, very familiar imagery.
Yeah, I mean, if that structural narrative sounds intimately familiar to anyone raised in the Abrahamic traditions, the historical timeline of when these Zoroastrian ideas first appeared is definitely enough to make you pause and reflect on how religions evolve.
The historical transmission of these ideas is a massive field of study. Scholars heavily debate how these concepts moved from Persian Zoroastrianism into Judaism during the Babylonian exile, and subsequently laid the groundwork for Christianity and Islam.
It's a huge web of influence.
It is. But regardless of the exact transmission routes, the structural parallels are undeniable. However, there is one monumental difference in how Zoroastrianism handles the final judgment compared to later traditions.
The river of molten metal.
Yes.
According to the ancient texts, at the absolute end of time, every human being who has ever lived must walk through a massive river of molten metal. For the righteous, the people who spent their lives aligning with truth and order, it will feel like walking through warm milk.
Quite a pleasant image.
Yeah. But for the wicked, the people who aligned with deception and chaos, it will burn like the literal molten metal it actually is.
But here is the critical distinction that separates it from modern concepts of damnation. It burns, but it does not damn them forever.
And that one detail changes the entire character of God. We talked earlier about how the concept of an eternal physical hell feels like a tyrant locking a disobedient child in a burning basement forever.
Right, infinite punishment.
Exactly. It's a concept of infinite punishment for finite crimes, which is exactly what drives so many people straight to atheism today. It feels inherently unjust.
Absolutely.
But the Zoroastrian molten river is entirely different. It's more like a highly skilled surgeon excising a malignant tumor. The surgery is painful, yes, but the ultimate goal is to save the patient. It is the ultimate form of restorative justice.
That is an excellent analogy. It is a purifying ordeal, not a punitive one. The intense suffering in that river burns away the corruption of the drush, the lie. It strips away the trauma and the chaos.
Wow.
And once the wicked are cleansed, They step out of the river and join the righteous. It is a doctrine of ultimate, universal salvation.
Ah.
The only thing that is completely ontologically annihilated in that river of metal is Angra Mainyu, the adversary.
Evil itself.
Yes,
Yeah.
evil itself. The very source of chaos simply ceases to exist.
It is an incredibly optimistic view of the end of the world. The physical universe isn't thrown in the trash or abandoned for some ethereal cloud. It's completely renovated and perfected.
When you synthesize this entire historical journey, it is truly remarkable to see how deeply these ancient ideas permeate the architecture of our modern reality.
Yeah, it really is.
We started with the intense theological puzzle of a limited God fighting an independent, uncreated evil. We explored how humans localize that fear of the unknown into physical hells and sacrificial valleys.
And how that very human fear mutated into local panics like the Jersey Devil.
Right. Or the deeply complex psychological terrain of demonic possession.
And we ended with the invention of the future itself, the radical idea that time isn't a trap, but is actually moving toward a meaningful resolution.
The ethical frameworks you use to judge right and wrong, the way you understand personal agency and responsibility, and even the way you view history as progressing forward rather than repeating in endless, meaningless circles, these were all born from these specific ancient debates over the nature of evil.
That's wild to think about.
You are utilizing their philosophical architecture every single day to make sense of the chaos around you.
You know, that leaves me with one final thought. Even if you are a strict atheist and completely reject the idea of God, the devil, or any spiritual realm, your belief in human progress, the fundamental idea that tomorrow can be better than today, and that we are collectively marching toward a more perfect, enlightened society, is actually a secular echo of ancient Zoroastrian eschatology. You might have abandoned the theology, but you're still living inside their timeline. Something to think about the next time you look at the clock.